All right, so I'm going to continue on. We've gone over the basics. Now we're going to move on and focus on that sugar phosphate backbone. So let's title this Backbone. And we know that it's a sugar phosphate backbone. So we know that part of it is going to be a sugar, part of it's going to be a phosphate. The sugar that is in DNA is called deoxyribose. So it ends in ose. That lets us know that it is a sugar. And this deoxy part means that it's actually a ribose sugar, but it's deoxy. It's missing an oxygen. So it's a deoxyribose sugar. And like our other sugar, glucose, that we've talked about a lot, it's going to have an oxygen that is sort of in the middle of the ring structure. And deoxyribose is a 5-carbon sugar, but only 4 of the carbons are in the ring. So I'm going to draw those 4 carbons. And then there's 1 more carbon that's outside of the ring, and it is attached here. All right, this carbon here has an OH attached to it. Now, it also has a hydrogen attached to it, but I'm not going to draw that. And the reason I'm not going to draw that is we often need to simplify these models to make them make sense. So this carbon has 3 bonds. And we know from previous learning that carbon has to have 4 bonds. So we know there's something else bonded to this carbon. Anytime that we leave off a bond, it's not because carbon is missing that bond. It's because that carbon is actually bonded to hydrogen. So there is a hydrogen attached here. I'm just not going to draw it. I'm not going to draw anything on this carbon. And that tells you that there is also hydrogen attached to this carbon. Now this carbon has 2 bonds, which tells me that it's going to have 2 hydrogens attached to it because it only has 2 bonds and it needs 4. 4 minus 2 is 2. This carbon here has an O bonded to an H. So it has 3 bonds. So does it have any hydrogens attached to it? If you said yes, you're correct. It has 1 hydrogen attached. This carbon also has 1 hydrogen. This carbon here is bonded to an O bonded to an H. It has 2 bonds, so how many hydrogens are attached to this carbon? If you said 2, you are correct. All right, all sugars having this ring structure, it's really important that we're able to talk about which carbon and know which carbon we're talking about at any given time, because they do have different things bonded to them. So I might want to say, oh, the second carbon, and I'm going to want you to know which carbon that is. So whenever we count carbons, we start at the oxygen and we move around the ring in a clockwise direction. So I'm going to write this as a note for us. So start counting carbons at the oxygen. And then I'm going to say count clockwise. So if I start with my oxygen here, that means that if I go clockwise, this is my first carbon. So that's going to be carbon number 1. This is my second carbon, my third carbon, my 4th carbon, and this is my 5th carbon. So this has 5 carbons. My 1 and my 3 and my 5 carbons have OHs attached to them. The other ones do not. Now, ribose, the reason that it is, this is deoxyribose, is because ribose has an OH here, but deoxyribose just has an H. It's missing that oxygen. So again, I'm not going to include that in my drawing, but that is why this is named deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay, the next thing in my backbone is the sugar has to be attached to a phosphate. So I'm going to move up and I'm going to talk about the next part, which is the phosphate. And a phosphate, the fact that it ends in 8 tells me that there's oxygen, and the phos part tells me that there's phosphorus. So a phosphate is P for phosphorus, and it's going to be double bonded to oxygen, also bonded to an OH, also bonded to an OH, and bonded to an O. Now, oxygen needs to have 2 bonds, and phosphorus can have 5. So phosphorus has its 5 bonds. Oxygen, it has its 2 lone pairs of electrons, so it only needs 2 bonds. What that means is that this oxygen over here doesn't have enough electrons, and this phosphate is actually negatively charged. So there's a negative on that oxygen because that oxygen is negatively charged. It has extra electrons that have been added to it, making it negatively charged so that it doesn't have to have an extra bond. So this oxygen, its electron shell is full. I put that negative too close. But that means that it's negatively charged because it now has more electrons than it has protons. And so overall, this phosphate molecule is negatively charged, which also gives DNA a negative charge. So overall, the structure that is DNA is a negatively charged structure. Okay, we're going to pause there, but before we pause, I'm going to give you some instruction. You have a sheet that looks like this in front of you. And what I need you to do is I need you to cut out each of those pieces very nicely along the lines. So once they're all cut out, you should have a bunch of individual pieces that look like this. So go ahead and cut out all of those pieces and then start the next video.